It's really an exciting lineup in the coming weeks and a perfect way to address the substantial evidence gap when it comes to calf injuries. So these injuries are an issue in sport and really underrepresented in the literature for the burden they present to us as clinicians. So it will be a really informative month of lectures that I'm sure you will enjoy. I would like to acknowledge my colleague Brady Green, who has just submitted his PhD and whose studies I will discuss to highlight the risks, epidemiology and prognosticating return to play following calf muscle injury. I have no potential conflicts of interest to disclose, and I will not be discussing any off-label or unapproved use of drugs or products in this presentation. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, we'll be able to outline the associated risk factors for calf muscle injury, examine epidemiological features, and evaluate potential factors associated with return to play and recurrence after calf muscle strain injury. So we know that calf muscle strain injuries are common in terrestrial sports. In many running-based sports, they are second only to hamstring injuries in their prevalence, and that's certainly true for Australian football, which is where we've done most of the research that I'll be presenting. The peak rates of prevalence are as high as 23% in marathon runners and 8% in male ballet dancers. The UEFA football studies show a season prevalence of 6%, and in Australian football, we also have a season prevalence of around 6%. The burden of injury is also high, with a recurrence rate of between 4 and 16% over the past 8 years for the Australian Football League, and time lost between 4 and 102 days. The UEFA football studies highlight recurrence rates of 14%, with time loss varying between 1 and 95 days. And we know that there's evidence of greater time loss with recurrent injuries. But there is limited literature and evidence relative to the problems calf strains represent and when muscle strain injuries. So little is really known about the epidemiology of these injuries and their characteristics of injured athletes. And that's really where our studies come in. And I'm presenting, well, the aim of this presentation really is to address some of the gaps in our understanding. And just to really demonstrate the difference in the evidence that's out there, for example, we did this calf systematic review that I'll discuss in a moment. And we found 10 studies that were eligible for inclusion. In comparison to our recent systematic review of risk factors for hamstring strain injury, where we found 78 studies that were eligible for inclusion. It's quite different. And again, just demonstrates that lack of evidence and evaluation so far of calf muscle injuries. But going back to the systematic review of calf muscle injuries, those 10 studies included 518 calf muscle strains. We looked at the quality using a modified QIPS, and we used a best evidence synthesis to determine the level of evidence for each potential risk factor and its association with calf muscle injury. This is just a schematic representation of that best evidence synthesis, where there's a strong level of evidence. It's up the top here, with the red identifying that it's an increased risk and the green identifying that there's no change in risk with this particular factor. And our main finding of the study was, not surprisingly, that older age and a past history of calf muscle strain injury were intrinsic risk factors with strong level of evidence for increasing the risk of calf muscle strain. There was limited evidence of an increased risk of injury with a past history of an adductor strain, a past history of a hamstring strain, a past history of step strain, and a past history of knee injury, and an increase in BMI. There was no change in risk or no increased susceptibility dependent on weight, dominant leg, height, or sex. When we're looking at extrinsic risk factors, there was limited evidence that the pre-season period was an extrinsic risk factor for calf muscle injury, conflicting evidence that playing position was important for risk, and no evidence that schedule congestion, the competition standard, or environmental factors such as temperature and rainfall, had an impact on risk for future calf strain injury. So the key findings, as I said, not surprisingly, that non-modifiable intrinsic risk factors of older age and history of calf muscle injury are the strongest risk factors for future calf muscle strain. Do you have hamstring, quad, adductor injury? Some evidence of an association. And that the most modifiable intrinsic risk factors that we think about in terms of muscle strain are largely unexplored. Things like muscle function, strength and power, fascicle length have not been investigated in calf muscle injuries. Injury type, so the index versus a recurrent injury and the muscle injured, soleus and gastroc, were overlooked or not included. So we couldn't subgroup based on these. So there's really quite limited information about risk factors for calf muscle injury based on the literature. We did conduct a qualitative study that interviewed 20 experts, considered experts in calf injury or muscle injury from around the world, with the aim of generating recommendations for assessment and management of calf strains. These studies are currently under review, but hopefully will be accepted soon or out soon so that everyone can have a read of what the experts think about these areas. So part 1 focus on evaluating and preventing calf strain injuries, and part 2 focus on rehab and return to play decision making. And so the reason I'm presenting these here is we also asked the experts what they thought about risk factors for calf injury to try and bulk up what we kind of knew about what we found out with the literature, which wasn't all that much. And so the experts highlighted a number of factors that had been identified as potential risk factors in the systematic review. So the chronological age and the past history of injury, the body mass, increase in body mass index and being in the pre-season period. But they also identified other potential predisposing factors that should be considered and certainly should be considered in future research. So non-modifiable intrinsic factors such as decreased training age, ethnicity, general hypermobility, genetics, and other injury states or subclinical states of the lumbar spine, ankle, foot, and the first MTP joint. And modifiable intrinsic rates were very much around the calf function and capacity, so strength, coordination, power, ballistic function, the athlete's running capacities, their fatigability of the calf, their biomechanics, and their dorsiflexion range. The activity-related extrinsic factors were things such as demands of sport, their playing position and competition schedule, which a couple of those were reviewed in the systematic review, but probably the most commonly noted factor was training errors or workload. So acute to chronic workload, sudden increases in running loads. So that was really the big focus. Things such as changes in footwear and changes in surfaces were also highlighted. Non-activity related extrinsic factors such as performance culture, coach expectations and athlete behaviour were reported as potentially impacting on the risk of injury. And so we also discussed with the experts factors related to recurrences or poorer outcomes or following the index injury. And so they included things like, the experts suggested things like increased chronological age, previous calf injury, other injury history and exposure history as being important factors that may influence the risk of recurrence. So all of these factors can potentially impact on the calf function, the mechanics of the calf, the mechanics of the athlete, their fatigability, and the general conditioning of the calf and the general conditioning overall. And so that can increase risk of recurrence. It may also, that was suggested it could also increase the return to play timeframe. So this has really important implications, as I said, from not so much from the literature. The literature suggests older age and past history, but we're probably all really aware of that. The past lower limb injury, that greater BMI, was also supported by the experts. But the other factors really surrounding the past history of lumbar spine, ankle, foot, first MTP, the calf capacity, so strength, coordination, function, power, fatigability, and obviously workloads, so really haven't been explored in the literature, but definitely should be considered when you're working with your athletes and the teams. So what do we know about how calf injuries occur, when they occur, how, and to whom? So we also, after the systematic review, we went on to look at the epidemiology in Australian football players of calf muscle strain injuries. And the aims are really to describe the features of calf muscle strain in these players, to identify whether there were potential differences in functional progression and return to play for index versus recurrent strains, and for injuries involving soleus versus gastroc, and for the mechanism of injury. So we had 184 calf strain injuries, separated into around 126 soleus, 17 gastroc. There were 6 other muscles in the calf. 35 were unknown because they didn't have MRIs associated with them. 149 of the injuries were index injuries and 35 were recurrences. Of the index injuries, 94 involved soleus, 14 gastroc, and the 41 other or unknown. And of the recurrences, the majority were for soleus. So when did they occur? Was it in the match or was it in training? So for index injuries, it was reasonably even, with slightly more occurring during match play. Whereas for recurrent injuries, it was more occurring during training. For soleus injuries, again, slightly more during match play, but reasonably even. Whereas for gastrocnemius injuries, it was much more common that they would occur during match play as opposed to training. And when during the match, so an Australian football game is broken up into 4 quarters of around 20 minutes plus some time on. And as you can see in the orange, the soleus injuries were much more commonly occurring or identified after the game. So they weren't detected or felt so much during the game, but once the player had stopped, maybe even the next day, is when they detected a soleus injury. So almost 1/3 were post-game. Whereas in gastroc, it was much more common that they occurred in that first quarter. In terms of the stage of the season, so the Australian football season goes from around March to towards the end of September, if you're lucky enough to be in the finals. And then the pre-season, have a little break, and then the pre-season goes from late October, early November through to the season start again. So as you can see, index injuries were most common early in the competitive season, so 19.7% around March, April, and with the second highest peak late in the competition season. Whereas recurrences were most frequent late in the competition season, so 25%, or late in the pre-season part of the, well, late in the pre-season, sorry. And what about the mechanism of injury? So again, in the orange is soleus, in the green is gastrocnemius. And we looked at things such as a nil-specific mechanism where the player couldn't really identify any actual incident, and similarly gradual onset where they just felt a little bit of a niggle and it potentially got worse throughout the game or after the game. Landing, jumping, sudden change of direction, kicking, deceleration, steady state running, high intensity running, and acceleration. And so you can see that for soleus, half the injuries occurred where there was no inciting mechanism or inciting event. And soleus injuries generally occurred more so during steady state running as opposed and acceleration. Whereas the gastrocnemius injuries tended to occur during high-speed running and acceleration and were less common during steady-state running. In terms of index in the blue and recurrences, we'll see shortly in the red, you can again see that contrary to other muscle strain injuries that usually have an attributable mechanism, almost half of the index injuries occurred without a known inciting event, while 60% of recurrences occurred during running-related activities. So index injuries, much more likely without a specific event, recurrences much more likely with a running-related mechanism. And when we looked at this statistically, if you had in an index injury, a running-related activity versus non-running related activity, then you had an increased risk of a longer time to return to play. So on average, it took another 11.9 days longer to return to play if you had a running-related activity mechanism. And what are the outcomes following injury? So we did look at return to play, which is in the final column, but we also looked at 3 time points preceding this. So time to pain-free walking, time to running or days to running at greater than 90% max speed, and days to return to full training. And as you can see, when you compare the index injuries in the blue with the recurrent injuries in the red, that recurrent calf strain injuries took longer to return to play. And this was significant also for running at max speed, return to full training, and returning to play. So an additional almost 20 days to return to play if you had a recurrent injury. So that is important information when you're managing athletes and the teams. Comparing soleus, again in orange and gastroc in green, for those 4 milestones, not significant, but soleus did have an increased time to return to running at greater than 90% max, return to full training, and return to play. When we looked at the cumulative incidence of recurrent injury, it's important to note that 54% recurred within 2 months, and we deemed this to be an early recurrence. And when we looked at recurrence prior to the median time to return to play, which was around 21 days, then 1 in 5 or 20% actually recurred prior to that median time to return to play, so likely during the rehabilitation period. When we looked at recurrence, as we noted before, 91 primarily involved soleus. And statistically, when we looked at player characteristics, older players and players who are more experienced or exposed had a greater more incidence of recurrent injuries, So more likely to recur if they were older and had more game exposure or experience. So the clinical implications from this study, first of all, that soleus injuries are most prevalent in elite Australian football. So if someone has such an athlete has an injury, then you're probably already suspecting a soleus injury. Soleus may take longer to recover than gastrocnemius injuries, although this was not significant in our study. They're definitely most likely to recur. And 54% will recur within that first 2 months following the index injury. And this has great implications for management of index injuries and prevention strategies. And I'm certain that the next couple of presenters will talk about this and talk about prevention and managing to avoid recurrent injuries. If you have a player who's got a running-related mechanism of injury, then you may expect that they have a greater time loss, a greater time to return to play. And there's evidence of differences in that mechanism of index versus recurrent injuries and soleus versus gastrocnemius injuries. And so again, when you're starting your assessment, if a player is telling you about what mechanism of injury or how it occurred, you may start to think about a particular muscle, you may start to think about time loss, and it may inform your assessment and certainly may inform your management a little. Okay, so that was our epidemiological study. Then following on from that, so after establishing epidemiology, which gives you some, good insight into what's happening with some of the calf muscle injuries, particularly in Australian football, we wanted to look at other factors that might impact on the prognosis of calf muscle injury. So this study was published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine in last year, 2020. The aims of the study were to describe the characteristics of index versus recurrent calf muscle strain injury observed on MRI and functional progression post-injury according to the anatomical location of the injury. And we also wanted to explore the association of clinical and MRI data on return to play and recurrence. So for this study, we had the 149 MRI positive calf strains. So the ones that we didn't have MRI for were excluded from this analysis. So we had 126 soleus injuries, 17 gastroc, 6 others. We had 114 index injuries and 35 recurrences. 94 of the index for soleus, gastroc 14 and 6 of the other. And again, 32 of the recurrences were soleus and 3 of gastroc. We had the MRI classification done independently by 2 radiologists, and they had de-identified scans, so they didn't know who the player was. We asked them to tell us which muscle was injured. We asked them to categorise the precise anatomical location. So for soleus, was it in the medial aponeurosis, the lateral aponeurosis, or the central aponeurosis? Or the posterior soleus aponeurosis, or for the gastroc, the anterior medial gastroc aponeurosis and the anterior lateral gastroc aponeurosis, or in the myofascial area. Excuse me. We asked them to tell us about the strain position, medial and lateral position, superior inferior position, and the depth of the injury. They categorise the presence and the extent of aponeurotic disruption. So where the extent was separated or classified as 0, less than 50%, excuse me, 50 to 99%, or 100% of aponeurotic disruption. A dichotomous yes or no for the presence of waviness. They categorised the craniocaudal length of edema. And again, a yes or no dichotomous evidence, whether there was evidence of previous injury, such as scar tissue. We included, based on our epidemiology study and some of the literature, we included some clinical factors to see if they could help us with prognosticating return to play and recurrence. And those clinical factors were chronological age, a history of previous calf, ankle or foot injury, a running mechanism, a dominant leg injury, Indigenous Australian, and the stage of the season. Our outcome measures were return to play, and similar to the other study, the 3 preceding milestones, which were return to full training, running at greater than 90% max speed, and pain-free walking, and recurrence. So we again categorised early as less than 2 months, or recurrence over a 2-season period as overall. We looked at a regression and survival analysis and Cox regression models to determine factors predictive of a worse prognosis for return to play and recurrence and the other milestones. So when we compare the time taken to return to play across the anatomical locations of soleus and gastroc injuries, so where central intramuscular aponeurosis, the lateral intramuscular aponeurosis, medial intramuscular aponeurosis, and the posterior aponeurosis are all of soleus, the anterior aponeurosis of the medial gastroc, the anterior aponeurosis of the lateral gastroc, and the myofascial injuries. And as you can see, there was considerable variability in prognosis across most of the common anatomical locations, where you can see on this axis the time to return to play, and there's a fair spread across the different anatomical locations. And not surprisingly, statistically, there was no association with time to return to play. However, if you do look at comparing time to reach all of those 4 functional progression or milestones to return to play, after in each of those different anatomical locations, but separated by, in the red, where there's injuries with aponeurotic disruption, and in the blue, with injuries at that same location, but without aponeurotic disruption. And so you can see there's quite a similar trajectory, but you can also see that where there's aponeurotic disruption, it seems to take longer number of days to reach at least the return to play milestone, and commonly those first 2 milestones leading up to that. And certainly what we found with this was that there was statistically significant differences in the soleus location where there was aponeurotic disruption. So for the central intramuscular aponeurosis, there was a significantly greater time to return to play where you had aponeurotic disruption compared to no. With the lateral intramuscular aponeurosis of soleus, then the 3 milestones running at greater than 90%, return to full training and return to play were significantly greater when you had aponeurotic disruption. And for the medial intramuscular aponeurosis of soleus, the return to full training and the return to play was significantly longer if you had aponeurotic disruption. When you pull all of these data together, regardless of the location, so just separating it into whether someone has aponeurotic disruption or not, then injuries where there was aponeurotic disruption took on average 8 days longer to return to play, and this was a significant finding. Similarly, when you looked at the severity of aponeurotic disruption, so grading it as none, less than 50% or 50 to 99%, then injuries with severe aponeurotic disruption took on average almost 12 days longer to return to play than if there was no aponeurotic disruption. There was no difference between the less than 50% and the 50 to 99% or greater. Looking at multivariable regression, first doing some univariate regression, we looked at those clinical data and the MRI data and to determine if there was any of these factors were related to the time to return to play. And the univariate analysis showed that a running-related mechanism, soleus injury, the presence of aponeurotic disruption, and having severe aponeurotic disruption, so when we're just in univariate analysis, all were associated with a longer time to return to play. But when you put all of those factors into a multivariate regression, then only a running-related mechanism of injury was related to a longer return to play time across all injuries. So it was the only factor that remained significant when the influence of the other clinical and MRI data were taken into account. So again, that may have implications for you guys when you're looking after your team or your athletes, to understand that running mechanism may be the most important factor when you're looking at prognosticating return to play. When we just looked at soleus injuries, so what I just spoke about was overall calf injuries. When you look just at soleus injuries and did the same analysis, then in fact the running related mechanism and the presence of aponeurotic disruption were both significantly related to having a longer time to return to play. So if you have a soleus injury with a running mechanism with aponeurotic disruption, then you're much more likely to have a longer time to return to play. We also explored the idea of that recurrent injury, and is it in the same location? Does it have the same severity as the index injury? So across that 2-season surveillance period, we observed actually that 40% of the recurrences were to the same muscle in the same anatomical location and position. And interestingly, just over 30% were in the same muscle, but in a different location and position. When we evaluated this same idea, but just in the early recurrences, where you would assume, or it has been surmised that if you have an early recurrence, it's likely in the same location because you already have a deficit potentially in that location. And certainly our findings kind of supported that idea. So 63% of those early recurrences were in the same muscle and anatomical location and position. So when we looked at whether having a aponeurotic disruption increased your likely, or the amount of the severity of aponeurotic disruption at baseline, does that kind of predict or increase your risk of a recurrence? And so we did find that muscles with aponeurotic disruption had a higher incidence of recurrence, so almost 63% versus 37% with no aponeurotic disruption. Although interestingly, again, the belief that if you have a recurrence, then it may actually be more severe than the index injury. And we actually found that there was the majority, so almost, or more than 2/3, or 2/3 actually, had the same severity in the recurrence as they had in that index injury, and that was based on MRI findings of aponeurotic disruption. So the aponeurotic disruption was the same severity in that recurrent injury. So then we wanted to evaluate what are some of the potential prognostic factors for recurrence. So we did a similar thing where we looked first of all at those clinical data of age, history of muscle strain and so on, and the MRI data that you saw before, to determine are any of these associated with that early risk of recurrence first. So the univariate analysis suggested that an older age and a history of a calf muscle strain and a history of an ankle injury were potentially associated with the risk of an early recurrence, so within the first 2 months. However, when we put those data into a multivariate regression, then it was just an older age athlete and a history of ankle injury that remained significant as a risk factor for early, or a factor associated with early recurrence. And again, when we just looked at the soleus injuries under multivariate analysis, then the only thing that remained significant there was being an older athlete. Looking at overall recurrence, so any recurrence within the 2 seasons of the index injury, from a univariate analysis, we found potential associations with older age, history of previous calf muscle injury, a running mechanism, and the presence of aponeurotic disruption, so just the dichotomous yes/no, to be potentially associated with a recurrence over 2 seasons. When we looked at the multivariate Cox regression, only clinical factors were significantly associated with recurrence overall. So older athletes and athletes with a history of calf strain injury at the time of the index injury were at greater risk of recurrence. And when we look just at the soleus injuries, then athletes with a history of calf muscle strain injury at the time of index injury was the only factor that could predict recurrence overall, that was predictive. Another important finding we did a post hoc analysis of was maybe, was it important if people rushed back, so the time to return to play, they rushed back, were they more likely to actually have a recurrence than if they took a longer time to return? And we found that that actually wasn't important. So the time taken to return to play didn't impact on the risk of a recurrence. So the clinical implications. So first of all, the anatomical location of injury was not valuable in our study for prognosis. And this is contrary to previous findings that a central intramuscular aponeurosis injury may have a worse prognosis for return to play. There could be a number of reasons for the differing outcomes, I suppose, in the findings. Certainly, our study is one of the largest studies, and it's a reasonably homogenous group where they all have the same amount of training, essentially the same spread of games throughout the season, and that may be a factor. There's potentially others. So from the clinical factors when you're reviewing your athlete, such as the mechanism of injury and importantly the running related mechanism of injury, and MRI findings, particularly your aponeurotic disruption, may together inform whether an increased return to play time frame is expected. So it may help somewhat with prognosticating your time to return to play. And this is consistent with findings that connective tissue disruption has a worse prognosis for return to play. So we found that the clinical factors of older age, previous ankle injury and previous calf strain are associated with an increased risk of recurrence, but not baseline MRI findings. So certainly, again, this could be useful when you're looking at the athlete in front of you. If they're an older athlete, if they have had these previous injuries, then you may need to be really mindful in terms of their rehabilitation and their prevention of a recurrent type injury. So thank you very much for your attention.